The next poem we'll be looking at is called Poppies by Jane Weir, published in 2009. And it is a poem about loss and remembrance. Like many others in this anthology, it is a war poem, but this time, rather than being from the perspective of the soldier experiencing war, it is from the perspective of the loved one left behind. In this case, a mother who sees her son depart for war. First, we'll read it and discuss its context before annotating it, paying attention to both language and form. And finally, as usual, we will think about which other poems in the Power and Conflict anthology you could compare it to. Three days before Armistice Sunday, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms of red, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Sellotape bandaged around my hand, I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like we did when you were little. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled blackthorns of your hair. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and this is where it has led me, skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless, without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf, gloves. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone, the dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. So, what's this poem about? It's the voice of a mother addressing her son, and it becomes apparent that he's gone to war, but it's an indefinite war, it's unspecified. It could be any war, and perhaps that's the point, that there's a universal nature about the experience of a soldier's mother when he goes to war. So 3 days after Armistice Day, the day to commemorate the ending of World War I, also known as Remembrance Day, a mother recalls pinning a poppy to the blazer of her son. And the poem details these fond memories she has of her son, getting ready for him to leave, grazing his nose in an Eskimo kiss when he was young. And this mother sees him off, presumably to war, resisting the urge to run her hands through his hair and embrace him as though he was still her small child. After he leaves, she goes to his room and releases a songbird. We presume metaphorically. Later, and we're not sure how much later, it's not specified, she climbs to a war memorial and sees a dove. And remember, a dove is often a symbol of peace. And she wishes more than anything that she could just hear her son's voice again. It isn't explicit whether or not her son lived or died, but the underlying sense of loss in the poem implies that it's the latter, and that the mother did lose her son in war. Let's think about the context of the poem. Armistice Day, or Remembrance Day, the 11th of November, which is the day the First World War ended, is commemorated by the symbol of a poppy. This is because poppies grew in abundance on the battlefields of World War I. You have the famous Remembrance poem by a Canadian in Flanders Fields where poppies blow, and we must also consider the colour of poppies. Red, and as such, they evoke the image of blood. They remind us of the blood stain after blood shed in war. In Jane Weir's poem, therefore, the title immediately alerts us to the theme of remembrance. Now, Jane Weir was born in 1963, and she grew up between England and Italy, and she lived in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, so during the Troubles. She has 2 sons, which is why she explores what a mother might experience and might feel if a son were to go to war. Jane Weir has said that she was thinking subliminally of Susan Owen, mother of Wilfred Owen, whose poem Exposure is in the collection and that we've looked at. In the past, Weir said she endeavoured to write a war poem from a woman's perspective, since it is usually a subject matter we're only shown through a masculine lens. And that's certainly true of the poems we've looked at so far. They're from the perspective of the soldiers themselves. Jane Weir was also a designer, so that explains all the references to textiles and material. Poppies was written after Carol Ann Duffy, who wrote another poem in the collection, commissioned Weir and other poets to raise awareness of British soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's an interview of Weir where she discusses the inspiration behind this poem and the reason of her writing it, which I will link in the description below. Let's annotate it. And as with so many of these, we need to consider the title of the poem and, of course, the symbolism or embolism of poppies. Let's think about a poppy as a flower. Now, a poppy is beautiful and delicate, but it's also deeply connected to war and loss. And both the title and that first line immediately alert us to the themes of loss, remembrance, and war. And this idea of poppies being placed on individual war graves. In this opening, you have a foreboding, a foreshadowing of the death that it's hinted comes later in the poem. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, a second person address. And immediately it isn't clear who she's addressing. We learn later it's a mother addressing her son. But that second person address intensifies the emotion of the dramatic monologue, this maternal tone. And this then, crimped petals, spasms of paper red disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Throughout, you have military language blended with the domestic. Petals, blazer. We have the fact that this is an item of clothing, but then we also have this disturbing spasm of red and a blockade. So you have this juxtaposition when two things are placed next to each other to highlight the difference between them. This juxtaposition, or this blending military imagery and domestic imagery. And what is the effect of that juxtaposition? Remember, throughout, whenever we identify a method, we then have to discuss the effect of that method. Well, this blending of the military and the domestic, it really shows the impact war can have on family life. That juxtaposition really highlights the impact. And again here, you have sellotape bandaged, the blending of the domestic and military or violent imagery. Same with here, spasms of red and bandaged. These two spasms we associate with pain, and bandages we associate with injury. So they're connotations of pain and injury, which contrast with the more domestic references. Steeled, the softening. So this mother is preparing her son, she's sort of grooming him, and she's putting on a brave face, despite wanting to graze her nose across the tip of his, like Eskimos. Throughout this, you get this bittersweet sorrow of the son growing up. She resists that impulse, but she wants to hold on to him as a child. She wants to freeze time in a way and keep him young forever so that she can keep him safe. And so throughout, this idea of grazing the tips of their nose, running the fingers through his hair, we have this sentimental, nostalgic image, especially of the two, grazing noses like an Eskimo's. If you don't know what an Eskimo kiss is, you should look it up because it's very sweet. And you rub noses together. And it's this sentimental, nostalgic image. And it's really showing the mother's tenderness, and it heightens the sense of loss throughout the poem. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. So the words to express the intensity of her emotion in that moment when her son is leaving is too much. They overwhelm. So in a way, her feelings transcend language, and that is communicated in these lines. You have the fact that also this sentence flows across a stanza break, and that mirrors the disjointed experience of the mother not being able to put her emotion into words. And that overwhelming, if you look, all my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. You don't have any connectives here. And remember, what we call that is a syndeton. When you don't have any connectives, you call it a syndeton. Her overwhelming emotion is emphasised by the asyndeton in these lines, because the asyndeton makes the list seem endless. of what's happening to her words. They're escaping, they're being rolled and flattened. We have this significant line, I was brave. And that's reminding that obviously when the idea of men going to war, the emphasis is always on their bravery and their sacrifice, fittingly, but equally, it's highlighting that actually the mothers need to be brave too. So when the soldier is leaving, the mother, not the soldier, must be brave. She must be brave as she sees him off. You have this wonderful simile, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. It's a poignant simile because it demonstrates the parents' hopes for their children, that the world will contain treasure, the world will provide them with something magic, the potential for them to achieve when they go out into the real world. But also, this highlights the devastating loss of potential, the loss of promise and potential if he dies. And the enjambment here, there's a lot of enjambment in this poem, but you could say that the enjambment here echoes that sense of overflowing possibility, like a treasure chest spilling over, what's waiting for this soldier going out into the world. And of course, her son is intoxicated with the possibility. It's showing that youthful eagerness to prove oneself, perhaps in war. And then it says the mother, after her son is gone, after he'd gone, she goes to his bedroom and she releases a songbird from its cage, a metaphor for letting a child go. It links to that symbolism. You know, we often have that expression of a bird flying the nest, and a mother has to prepare for her chick to fly off into the rest of the world and experience the world for themselves. That's what this metaphor captures, that sense of letting your child go out into the world and experiencing the danger of the world by themselves, where they can no longer be protected in the nest or here, the cage. So, I mean, in terms of different interpretations, you could look into the connotations of cage as well. And then it's interesting because it says later, a single dove. So this idea of birds continues, and this time it's a dove, and the dove comes later as well. So the dove must be quite symbolic. Later, it doesn't say how much later. Is this years later? Is this months later? It's implied that it's quite a long time later. I don't know, maybe you disagree with that. But for me, it's much later that she then goes and she follows this dove up to the war memorial, that comes quite a bit later after her son has left. And this is where it has led me. So the dove has led her on, and her my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless without. Again, you have this sewing imagery that links to motherhood and domesticity that could represent her holding on to normalcy after her world has been irrevocably shaken by the loss of her son. That could be one interpretation. But then again, you have reinforcements. Again, you have the blending of the military and domestic. And that could, as we discussed earlier, reflect the impact that war has on the familial world, on the world of the family, and on the domestic life. And this sewing imagery, is it linked to the mother holding on to normalcy or trying to hold on to normalcy after the world is completely shaken by her loss? That could be one way of seeing it. And so she reaches the top of the wall, and then you have the war memorial, which is a very tragic edifice, and she leans against it like a wishbone. That simile reflects the mother's wish for her son to return home, but the fragility of a wishbone, how easily it's broken, that perhaps reflects the hopelessness of that wish, that it's impossible, or the impossibility of that wish. Her son can't come home if he's been lost in war. And then the speaker talks about the dove pulling freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. That's a very striking image of a dove. If you think a dove is the symbol of peace, but it's coupled with this stitch being caught. You can imagine when someone is sewing, you know, when a thread is caught and it tugs on the whole piece and affects the whole piece, and you can really, really see that image. Again, it's perhaps reflecting that interruption to familial life, to family life. And you have that really poignant final line when she pauses. And throughout, you've had this domestic, this sartorial imagery of sewing and stitching. And it ends with this haunting final message of the mother's wish, just wanting to hear her son one last time. But it is, of course, implied that she'll never hear him again, really elucidating that sense of loss that runs throughout the poem. And it demonstrates to us the bleak reality that mothers who lose their sons face, that once they're lost to them, they'll never hear their voices again. In terms of its form, this poem is a dramatic monologue of a mother addressing her son. Like others in the anthology, it doesn't have a specific rhyming meter or structure, so it's in what we call free verse. There's no pattern even in the stanza lengths, which contributes to the sense of it being a stream of consciousness, the emotional deluge or outpouring of a mother's loss. The poem's structure therefore reinforces the lack of control that usually accompanies grief or bereavement. And which poems could you compare it to in the anthology? An effective comparison would be to Kamikaze, because they both explore the psychological impact of war and come from voices not from those who are going to war themselves, but from the people left behind. In Poppies, though, it's implied that there is a physical loss and then the mother does lose her son. In Kamikaze, though, the loss is more symbolic because the pilot does return, only his family never speak to him again because they think that he dishonoured them. So it's been a symbolic death in the family rather than an actual death. You could also compare it to Exposure or Remains because both focus on the suffering of war. Obviously, Exposure and Remains are from the perspectives of the soldiers themselves, whereas Poppies is from the perspective of the loved one left behind. I hope this was useful and that it helped deepen your understanding of the poem. Like many others in the anthology, it also centres on war and reflects the pity of war, as Owen puts it, but it gives us a new perspective that the other poems haven't so far, and that is the perspective of the ones left behind. We are, in this poem, given a window into a mother's grief and loss and longing to return to a time when she had her son. It's a very haunting poem in that respect, but very different to the other war poems we've encountered so far.